Hello, this is Sandy, Natal Santa, and this is week 11, PowerPoint about developing evidence-based practice. Sorry for my throat, I got sick this last week and I'm just kind of getting over cold, so sound a little funny, but want to provide you this information whether I sound kind of funny or not. Anyway, our learning outcomes for today are to differentiate between research utilization and evidence-based practice. And that's not an exact line. There's kind of some fuzzy between those two, but we'll talk about that. Then to identify evidence-based practice models and locate online resources for evidence-based practice. That's the learning outcomes for the kind of the week. We won't cover much on the online resources today, but you'll definitely find that in the Blackboard. So when you're looking at evidence-based practice, you're looking at conscious and judicious use of current evidence in conjunction with clinical practice and patient values. So looking at kind of what's out there. While with research utilization, it's a process of using research findings to improve patient care, and it includes critique of studies, dissemination of research, and determining the application of practice. Well, it's a little bit different, but I think they're very close. Utilization of research came first in the 1970s and 80s, and it was kind of the basis. So, because in the past there were a lot of research studies, and there still are, that people put up on a shelf and leave in a digital archive or on a paperback archive and don't use. The research findings need to be the basis of change in clinical practice. They need to challenge researchers to make implications for clear practice and not just be kind of out there. Studies were reviewed by researchers and clinical teams, and from that there was development of research-based protocols and practices, and that still happens today. But now the more present term, the more current term is evidence-based practice, and it started in about the 1990s, and it's definitely going on from there. There's been a couple little changes, even a couple changes since this PowerPoint was originated, that it's kind of taking on. I'll talk about those later. But definition is the integration of best research evidence with clinical expertise and patient values. So, like, very similar to what the other one was. It includes research utilization, the use of case reports, expert opinions, and patient values and preferences need to be included. Some of the keystones of evidence are that we have a patient concern. In a clinical experience, we look at some data and research and see what else is going on and what's the best practice, and then use that all pulling together to have our evidence-based practice defined and moving forward. There are a lot of places for research evidence and even non-research. In terms of evidence-based practice, one should look at cost effectiveness and look at, so this product works really, really well. Is it worth the 5 times the amount of another product that works fairly well? Also benchmarking data. So what does this show? What does the data show that something helps or not helps? Clinical expertise is also involved. The clinician who is looking at the data and looking at the research also brings in their own knowledge as they're working forward. Infectious control data can be used in terms of looking at best practices, in terms of maybe a dressing change. What is more likely to cause an infection versus not? We can look at international and national and even local standards. In terms of lawsuits and legal action, local standards are actually what's used. If something happens nationally but it doesn't happen locally, that's important. And in particularly small towns, let's talk about like Ely. Small town, they don't have the same equipment, they don't do the same thing as they would do in a big city, maybe like Reno, Vegas, or definitely Los Angeles. So we need to look at what happens in these different areas. We can look at quality improvement and risk data, to what kind of things have been happening in terms of if we do this, does this happen? Is this good or is this bad? And sometimes even chart reviews are looked at, even retrospective or current chart reviews, to see what's happening. So the point of evidence-based practice that we improve patient care, we contain costs, we assist in meeting the Joint Commission's requirements, but in order to do that, it needs to be systematic and promoted within an organization. At least that is the best of evidence-based practice. And the book and this PowerPoint, it's set up as it's this kind of larger group process. Evidence-based practice doesn't necessarily have to be in a big group. As a nurse, you can do your own research and you can look at what happens and move forward even without having a big team as it's described in this PowerPoint and in the book. There is the Iowa model of evidence-based practice, and that is in your book if you look at page 390, and it talks about some things that need to be done. The problem focus trigger, so something becomes a concern, a clinical problem, and then we take a look at focus on, what's triggering it. Is there new research or literature or something going on? Is a practice change warranted? Maybe something hasn't been going well, but it's not going badly, so maybe it's not a good time to change. It's important, if you can, to form a team so you have some help in doing this. Use existing evidence or gather more evidence, and that may include doing a research study in your own. One in which you include patients. It might also be a meta-analysis or a meta-synthesis. Those are two terms that we talked about in qualitative and quantitative research. And then you want to institute the change of practice and monitor to see, is that change helping? Is there an improvement? Hopefully so. An example, a decision-driven evidence-based practice with this model, you apply scientific knowledge as part of a new practice policy and procedure and intervention. And it might be, for example, ambulating a patient. When would be the best time to ambulate a patient who has had knee surgery? Taking a look at the literature, seeing what the literature says, and looking at nursing and physical therapy. This would be a great time to include a team member, having a physical therapist be involved, a doctor, a surgeon involved, all really important in terms of moving forward and providing the best care possible. And so we look at the practitioner, but we also look at the organization and how will this affect the organization. Maybe it'd be better to walk a patient every 3 hours on the 3rd day, but do you have the staff and the ability to do that? So that's one of the things that you think about as you do evidence-based practice. Moving on, another buzzword, translational science. This goes very closely with evidence-based practice, and it is the study of how research findings are applied to practice. So they're saying, you have these big research articles that are and sometimes seem to be written in another language, but how are we going to translate that to everyday practice? And there's actually quite a bit of money going to these types of studies recently because they were paying for a lot of people to do research and realizing, it's not really going anywhere. They're getting published, but people aren't using it. So let's study how that happens. And so there's research that looks at what are the barriers and what helps facilitate the knowledge transfer from research into the practice. And then what can we look at in terms of organizational predictors and maybe hopefully change to improve adherence to evidence-based practice guidelines. Groups that are now promoting translational studies include the Agency for Healthcare Research and Quality, the National Institute of Health, the Veterans Administration, and the Institute of Medicine. Which, even though you think medicine is not doctors, it actually covers nurses very closely too. And all these organizations have websites, and you can find lots of information on this work on their website, so I encourage you to take a look at that. Steps to carrying out an evidence-based practice. Once again, this is looking at it as a kind of big, more systematic way of doing it. It doesn't necessarily have to occur this way. It can be smaller, but this would be the best way to do it. First of all, I mentioned about having a trigger. What's going on? What doesn't seem right? What doesn't feel right? Or just what's going on in someone's brain that says, hey, we need to take a look at this. Hopefully it's problem focused in terms of what do we need to fix. Certainly knowledge, you need to have knowledge to fix problem, and it's focused very heavily on problems. And how significant is that problem? Is it a widespread thing? Is it a small thing? Does it have significant outcomes? If it's a problem that keeps on arising and people are dying, that's going to be really important and one that you want to look for. So think, what are potential landmines? If you're talking about changing practice, for example, or I mentioned about ambulating a patient earlier after maybe a knee replacement or hip replacement. If you don't include the physical therapist, that's going to be a big landmine. They're going to be pissed, and they're not going to work. Same with the orthopedic surgeons. You want to include that. Other things that might be a problem, staffing, cost, stuff like that. Those are also issues. So what kind of data can you look at? Do you have information about patient outcomes, about what's currently happening? That can be very helpful in terms of where we are today. Is the topic multidisciplinary? Very, very few things are not multidisciplinary these days, so take a look and think about who needs to be involved. Because if change is really going to happen, all those involved need to be part of it. It's also important to have specific staff involved. It's mainly a nursing thing. Who are the big players and get things done on the hospital floor? You know who I'm talking about. The people who, if they say yes, it happens. If they say no, you better watch it. You want to include the people who are kind of the forces on the floor in order to make things happen. It is helpful to have consensus in terms of agreeing on making a change and agreeing on what, but first of all, just agreeing on what topic to look at is very helpful. So the team exists, the Nurse Practice Council in most places, but once again, doesn't necessarily have to be that big of a deal. You want to have some sort of task force. You want to include people who are stakeholders, and that would be people, physical therapists, physicians. Maybe it relates to dietary, having a dietitian on there. And the team must clearly define the question. And the book and a lot of websites talk about PICO, P being the patient population, I being the intervention, C being the comparison, and out comes the O. Now, if you look at more recent data and kind of information about the evidence-based practice, you'll see a T at the end, PICOT versus just PICO. PICOT represents a new change, with T being representative of time. For example, when I talked about walking the patient, the time frame might be within the first 3 days after surgery, or if you're looking at hospice patients, within the first week of admission. So that many times now they're putting a time on it because it makes a difference if you're talking within 72 hours or 3 weeks or 5 weeks or 5 years. So you will see many PICOs now to PICOTs. Sometimes there just really isn't a time frame, so you may not see it even if they're a newer evidence-based practice study. So steps. First of all, after you've defined what you're going to be studying, you start taking a look at the literature. What are the studies that have already been done? Are there any clinical studies? Are there meta-analyses? Remember that pulling together a pile of research studies, that can be real helpful. Integrative reviews, other existing evidence-based practice guidelines, that would help strengthen your need to change and your kind of power or suggestion that this needs to be changed. Evidence-based practice guideline sources include all of these: oncology nurses, American Pain Society, critical care nurses, Cochrane Library. If you haven't gone there, very amazing. Lots and lots of evidence there. But there are many more besides this list. When you do a research review, you want to take a look at hopefully you can get 10 what you consider good research articles to go by, or at least projects, case studies that can help support what you're looking at in terms of a solution. If you have fewer than that, it might be that your question, that the words that you're putting in your research study in terms of findings is not, or you're not getting that many. Let me start over again. Once again, I'm still not over my cold. If you're not getting many, you need to get a little broader. If you have more than 10, maybe you're too broad and you need to cut down. You don't want to get so overwhelmed by the data that you're not going to move forward. So take a look at what you got. Also, you want to look at the level of research, and you can see on this slide that there are a variety of different levels from 1 to 7. 1 being the meta-analysis, that really pulling together a variety of research studies, very, very strong. and give a lot of credence to that. Well, the other side is a report of expert committees. That can be people's opinions, and all their opinions can be wrong, or can be based on data that is not correct. So those are weaker. If you have like 10 only reports from experts, I'm going to think, that's not a real reason to change behavior. If you have 10 meta-analysis, that'd be hard to believe that that would come up, but maybe a couple meta-analysis, a couple experimental studies and quasi-experimental, maybe non-experimental, then you're going to be like, hey, this is looking strong. We've got some support for what we're doing. Evidence-based guidelines, particularly put together well, can also make a real big difference in terms of whether you make a change or not and what the strength of that is. As you are critiquing those articles you find, you might ask for some help from other people, depending on how many you get. If you have a journal club members could possibly each take a couple and review them, bring that information. If you have a team together, either novices and experts or a combination, have them review. If you are working at a hospital and you have students around, you can have a student do a couple of reviews or a few reviews, or it could be part of a class project. In terms of synthesizing research evidence, it's really helpful to create a table, to have those research information and results all there together. So Johnson & Johnson in 2010 said, so the first would be their name, like the second would be the year, so you can see, is this old stuff or is this new stuff? And then a little bit of findings of the results. I would also include the patient population if that information is available, to make sure that the population is what you're looking at. Because if they did a study, let's go back to the knee walking people, and it was all patients over 70, and you're really looking at patients in their 30s or 40s, it's going to be a difference. So you want to have some information about that. So what's similar, what's different, what did their findings show, was there some strengths and there's some weaknesses in their evidence, and putting that all on the table makes it really helpful. Once you get that down, take it to the team, have the team work on making some recommendations, and then also review that with stakeholders. Maybe some people weren't a part of the team, but they are important, so talking with them first. And then going ahead and saying, okay, what are we going to change? What's feasible? What's our risks and benefits? And how are we going to do that? It's helpful to put that into policy or procedure, at least some sort of guideline, listing the rationale, citing references, and having people review that so that you get their buy-in rather than having them go, I didn't see this, what's this about? That can really slow processes down. So as you implement, you want to keep a positive attitude. Make sure that you find clinicians that are committed, and if they're not, to try to convince them that they need to be committed. Make it feel real to them. How are they going to help the patients, and how are they going to help themselves by moving forward? A lot of people are like, I don't want to change, it's more work. But it's like, no, we need to do this, it's less work for you. That's really helpful. If you can get some sort of quick reference guide, a little check sheet, that's helpful. Can it be, is there something that needs to be adapted to the computer? Who can help you with that? Make sure that everyone understands what you're doing. Maybe have some in-services. Maybe you make a video or something like that. And then making sure that everyone has the skills and ability and knowledge to move forward. As you implement, you want to get opinions of leaders, change champions, core group, research committee, experts for consultation, nurse educators, and of course, depending on the size of the hospital and what you're doing, some of these people may not need to be involved at all, and others may need to, but certainly if it relates to patients, staff nurses, advanced practice nurses, nurse managers, charge nurses, doctorally prepared researchers. I'm really surprised they don't have doctors on those. I would certainly want to include doctors if it's something that relates to doctors, and even maybe indirectly. So you also then want to move forward in doing evaluation. So you made a change. Has it helped? Has the staff attitudes changed? Has patient outcomes changed? What are the barriers that you're perceiving? And finding some data that can help you compare, this is how it was, this is how it is, things are getting better or not. You want to find that out. So that is the beginning of evidence-based practice. I hope that was helpful, and I hope you're learning and enjoying this class. Take care. Bye now.